Well, good morning. My name is Brock. Welcome to Compass, where our mission is navigating people to God. And I'm actually our Colleyville High School pastor, so it's a privilege to be with you guys this morning. I've been here one other time, and I just love coming to this campus and getting to interact with you guys. I'm not going to lie, over the last couple weeks, I've had a pretty crazy season. We've been prepping for CIY, like Andrew said. Took over 300 students to CIY. It was just an amazing week. I didn't get to go because on July 19th, me and my wife had our first son. His name is Hudson. Here he is. Aw, yeah. He's our little baby, and he was born on July 19th. And so, the whole last week has consisted of no sleep and a ton of diapers. So it's been great. But preparing for that and having a baby, my heart or my tank is super empty. But my heart is really, really full. So I come before you this morning with a really full heart. I believe we've got a great message here. And for the past few weeks, we've been in this series called Me and My Big Mouth. And we've been talking about the power of words in our lives. And so we've been looking at the words of James, who's the brother of Jesus. And he said this. We're going to say it together. Ready? He says, be quick to listen and slow to speak. We're going to try it again. Quick to listen and slow to speak. He says our mouths are untamable. They're always a threat to the people and things that matter most. And so today we're in the final installment of that message. And if you've missed the last 3 weeks, you can always go to mycompasschurch.com. You can watch those messages online. And today might make a little more sense. And so I was born in a really small town in Illinois, about an hour south of Springfield, which is the capital of Illinois. Chicago is not the capital of Illinois, I promise. People always oh, so you're from Chicago. No, this is the corn part of Illinois. It's just corn and highways. That's all it is. And so it was a really small town. And I remember one day specifically, I was playing with my friends in the backyard. We played outside growing up. Imagine that. It was really cool. And we were playing with something called airsoft guns. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. Yeah? Okay. So if you haven't heard of that, airsoft guns are not quite like BB guns. They have these little plastic pellets, and they don't hurt as bad. But if you're 5 feet away, it's gonna leave a welt. It's gonna hurt a little bit, I promise. And so we were prepping, when they sell you an airsoft gun, they're you have to have the goggles with it, or we're not gonna sell you the gun. The goggles and the gun go hand in hand. Always have your goggles on, be ready for that. So we were about to start this airsoft war, and we were getting ready, getting geared up, and strapping up our boots and our war paint and everything. But I was hold on, guys, I have to go to the restroom. Wait for me, okay? Don't start without me. And so I went and took care of business, came back outside, and I didn't, my friends were gone. Where are they? I'm maybe they went to the corner store, get some sodas, get hydrated, get hyped up for this. But that didn't happen. So I hopped on the trampoline. I was okay, I'm just gonna wait for him to get back. Shoes off, goggles off, I'm not ready for anything. And so all of a sudden I see one of my friends come out from behind the tree, and he just looks at me this huge grin. And I was oh, we started. The fight has started. I had no idea. And, he raises his gun, and I just remember, it's a slow motion moment. I just remember, it was a super rainy day. It was kind of windy, but the rain had quit for this. So it was the wind was blowing like crazy, and it was just all in slow motion. He raised his hand, and he shot the gun. And I remember seeing the pellet, in slow motion, man, my eyesight is really good. But my eyes were open, not wearing my goggles. My eye was open. And so the airsoft pellet hit me in the eye. And so I go down, and I'm I can't see out of my eye, I can't see. And I said a few choice words, I was in middle school. I didn't know what I was saying, but I said a few choice words, I'm sure. But I was I can't see out of I'm freaking out. And so they call my mom, they're he can't see out of his eye, we're in trouble. And my mom's what are you talking about? So it's she rushes home from work, and she's okay, we gotta go to the eye doctor as soon as possible. And the eye doctor in Pana, Illinois, where I grew up, is not like the eye doctors you would have here in the Metroplex, probably. So they're we've never seen this before. I'm great. And so they didn't have any eye patches or anything. So they're okay, we're gonna cut a plastic cup in half, like we have out there for coffee, when you walked in. We're gonna cut one of those in half, and we're gonna tape it to your eye so you don't touch it like a little puppy. I was okay. And so and then we're gonna send you off to a bigger town with a better eye doctor, and they'll take care of you there. So I'm again, in middle school, I have a plastic cup taped to my eye, and you can imagine me in the car on the interstate, looking over Yeah, I don't, at the car next to me, I'm like, what is going on? It ended up being fine. But the doctor was like, if you get hit hard enough in that eye, you could have some permanent damage to that eye. So when you play football in high school, you have to wear a visor. In basketball, you have to wear these really huge, chunky goggles, and everyone's going to make fun of you for it. And every time you get the ball in basketball, everyone's going to be like, goggles, and it's going to be upsetting. You're not going to make any shots or anything. It was great. But I was like, I just remember being so mad at my friend and kind of just holding that grudge for a while because he hurt me pretty bad, like literally. And so come 10 years later, I'm about to turn, not 10 years, probably, I'm about to turn 21. And I get a phone call from a lady. I don't know if she's with like an insurance company or who she was with, but she called me and she's like, hey, Brock, just letting you know you have about a week left to file a claim if you want to get some pretty substantial money from this and kind of a settlement. I was like, oh, well, that sounds nice. I'm in college, got like a ton of student debt and trying to figure out how to not eat ramen every meal. And so I'm like, the money would be nice. But I was also like, I said, is this going to affect my friend? Like, is he going to have to pay any money? They're like, oh yeah, he'll have to pay some. I was like, shoot. And so I remember just dealing with that tension of like, I really kind of wanted revenge and like for him to be paid back, but also like this whole Christ follower thing and like forgiving and, loving people. I was like, okay. So I remember in that moment, not knowing what to do. So this is just in this moment, this is something maybe you faced in your life, not getting shot in the eye with an airsoft gun, but maybe you found yourself in a position of power over someone who's hurt you. You found yourself, and we see this all the time, that a lot of times what goes around often comes around. And so the powerless also often find themselves in a position of power. The people who hurt us may someday need us to come through for them. It's the idea that hurt people a lot of times hurt people. Bullied people a lot of times bully other people. Neglected sons become demanding husbands. Sometimes abandoned daughters can sometimes turn into suspicious wives. And in that moment, how we leverage our words says as much about us as anything else. And I want us to be ready for that moment because if it hasn't already happened, I believe it will someday. And I want us to be ready. So I'm just going to tell us a story today. And I really believe this is like the second greatest story in the Bible, right next to God sending Jesus down and saving us all. So this is my second favorite story. And so it all starts back in the book of Genesis. And if you've ever read Genesis, it could be a Netflix series. It's really interesting. So when a student comes to me, maybe they just got baptized or they're a new Christ follower and they're like, I want to read the Bible, where do I start? I don't usually direct them to Genesis because there's stuff in there like a lot of times as an adult, I don't know what to do with either. I'm like, I don't know why this is in the Bible, but it is. So I'm like, go read the Gospel of John. It's a little bit easier to read and probably just look at the life of Jesus because sometimes it can be rated PG-13 or maybe rated R, right? But in Genesis, in the beginning, it all starts with a man named Abraham. And Abraham was a desert nomad who God speaks to and calls him. He says, Abraham, through you, I'm going to bless the world. Your offspring is going to bless all the nations. Through your family lineage, all peoples of the earth are going to be blessed. And so in Genesis, we see this theme of trying to keep the family lineage intact, so that whoever's going to come later on in the story would come from this lineage. And so he has a son named Isaac, and Isaac has two sons. Their names are Jacob and Esau. That's a great story in and of itself. Go back and read it. But we're just going to talk about Jacob. And he has 12 sons. Jacob has 12 sons. And so what we're going to see with one of these sons, that the entire enterprise, the entire promise of God blessing the whole world through this one family would eventually hang in the balance of the words of one man. All of it would hang in the balance by the words of one man. And his name was Joseph. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about his life. And so Joseph was actually Jacob's favorite son because he was the son of Rachel, Jacob's favorite wife. Real quick, don't have a favorite wife. Done. Two, don't have a favorite son either. I know I'm my mom's favorite, but she would never say it. And you might have a favorite kid, but you're not, don't tell them that. Jacob actually says, Joseph's my favorite, right? And so his brothers kind of hate him. He gets special treatment. And so Joseph ends up having these dreams. And one of these dreams it involves the sun and the moon and 11 stars. He's got 11 brothers. And all these stars are bowing down to Joseph. And so he tells his 11 brothers. And they're like, oh, really? You're the youngest, buddy. Sorry. That's not happening. And so you get they don't like him. They don't like him at all. And so they hated Joseph because Jacob favored him so much. And so when Joseph was 17 years old, they took him, they stripped him of his clothes, and they threw him in a pit. They just threw him in a pit. And they had planned to kill him, but first they stopped to eat. You don't want to kill someone on an empty stomach, so here's where we pick up. So in Genesis 37, it says, as they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. And with a flood of compassion, he says, after all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. And his brothers are like, oh yeah, they agreed. He is our brother. And so they sell him as a slave. They sell him to these people. Again, he's 17 years old at this point. He doesn't know who he's going to end up with. He doesn't know what he's going to be purchased for. And they wave goodbye knowing they're never going to see him again. And he just looks back knowing he's never going to see his father or his family or his brothers again. And that's where we pick up in Genesis 39. Now, Joseph had been taken to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian, was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. He bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. And the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered. And I just want to pause for a moment because it seems to me that if the Lord was with Joseph, he would be home with his father. Joseph, however, chose to live as if God was with him. That was an active choice he made. And then after many years, Potiphar ends up putting Joseph in charge of his entire household. He shows great leadership capabilities, which means he has some real power and some real influence in his household. And now Joseph must have been a good-looking dude because Potiphar's wife demands that Joseph sleep with her. He tells her was probably a first no, and this is astounding because Joseph, in essence, was still a slave. Slaves did not say no to their masters. You did not say no to someone who owned you. This is not something you did. And his reason for doing this is even more astounding. Here's what he says in verse 9. He says, how then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? Again, I'm reading this. I'm like, the same God who allowed you to be sold and separated from your family? And day after day, Potiphar's wife demands, but he keeps avoiding her. And then she then accuses him of attempted rape, and Potiphar actually believes her. Here's what it says in verse 20. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. Again, don't you think that if God is with you, she goes to prison? You don't go to prison. She goes to prison. Here's what it says. He says he showed him kindness. God showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. If the Lord is with you, you don't have a personal relationship with the prison warden. You're not buddies with the prison warden if God is with you. And with this comes a very, very harsh reality. And we all know this to be true because we've experienced it at one point or another. It's this. It's that bad things have been happening to good people for a long time. Bad things have been happening to good people for a long time. And some of us may be in bad times right now. Maybe someone has hurt us, has taken from us. Our circumstances have put us in tough times. We're not sure if we're going to make it through this season. And here's what was true for Joseph, and I believe it's true for us as well. While this is true, there's something else that's true, and it's this. God has been with good people in bad times for a long time as well. God has been with good people in bad times for a long time as well. So after some time in this prison, Joseph continues to be impressive. Again, he has great leadership capabilities, and he ends up becoming an administrative assistant to the prison warden. So years keep going by, nothing happens, but Joseph maintains his faith in God. He continues to live as if God is actually with him. And so somehow, Pharaoh had a butler and a baker, and I don't know what they did, but they get thrown into prison. And there's one evening where Joseph looks at them, and they look super troubled. And Joseph notices that. He goes to them. He's like, hey, what's wrong? And they said, man, we've had some really disturbing dreams. Just last night, we both had these really weird dreams, and we don't know what they mean. And Joseph's like, hey, I have dreams too, and I actually interpret them. So maybe you could tell me your dream, and I can interpret it. Okay, and they do. So they tell him their dreams, and here's what happens. He tells the butler that his head is going to be restored to his original position. Like he's going to be the Pharaoh's butler again. His head will be restored. And he tells the baker, your head will be lifted in a different way, in that it will be separated from your body. Sorry. And so both of these come true. So he was right about both of them. The butler was restored to his original position. The baker was beheaded. And Joseph, as the butler is going back to his position, he says, hey, dude, remember me. Remember how I interpreted your dreams and they came true? Remember me. And I don't want to be in prison anymore. Just remember me. Just keep that in mind. So more years go by, and Joseph is now 30 years old. 30 years old. And then Pharaoh has a series of disturbing dreams. No interpreter, no medium, no magician can figure them out. And that's when his butler's like, oh, there's this guy named Joseph. He's kind of a crazy person in prison. He interpreted my dream, and it came true. You should ask him. And so here's what it says in Genesis 41. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And what Joseph says next are perhaps the most courageous words ever spoken by someone, especially by a foreigner whose God has kind of done nothing for him recently, but also because he's standing right in front of, face to face with one of the most powerful men on earth, arguably the most powerful man on earth at this moment. And here's what he says, I cannot do it. Imagine being the butler. You're like, hey, there's this guy in prison. He interprets dreams. He'll help you. And then he comes up and Pharaoh tells him the dream, and Joseph says this, I cannot do it. And the butler's thinking, hi ho, it's back to the dungeon I go, right? Yeah. But what happens next is even more astonishing. He says this, I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. This is even worse. This is way worse. He should have just stopped with, I can't do it. Because Pharaoh is actually, in Egyptian culture, considered a god. People talked to him like a god. They treated him like a god. He was actually considered a god in Egyptian culture. And so what Joseph is saying, he's like, Pharaoh, you're a little g god. My God is a big G God. So, and the butler's like, oh my gosh, what are you doing, dude? And so he says, he interprets the dream. And so he lays out the dream, and Joseph's like, here's what this means. So Egypt and the world is actually gonna have 7 years of extreme abundance. You're gonna have so much food, you're not gonna know what to do with it. It's gonna be awesome, but that's immediately going to be followed by 7 years of extreme famine. It's gonna be terrible. Nothing's gonna grow. All the crops, there will be nothing growing. All the crops will be gone. So he's like, you need to prepare in those first 7 years for the next 7 years after that. And so he's like, what a great plan. He's like, here's a plan. I have a plan. Maybe I can help you, right? If you get me out of prison, maybe I can help you. He says, you need to appoint someone to take 1/5 of the harvest, and you need to, from the 7 years, store it up in the cities. And then when the famine hits, people are going to come to you left and right. You're going to have all this food that you stored up for 7 years. Then you can sell that, keep the money. And it's like, what a great plan. Pharaoh agrees. And so here's what it says in verses 37. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and so wise as you. You, Joseph, shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. And so Joseph, he gets to work. He starts preparing the nation of Egypt for what's about to happen. And then they have this great time of abundance, and then the rain stops and everything stops growing. Crops don't come in. And then he opens the storehouses that they've been putting all this stuff in, and they start selling it, and they've got plenty of food, and it's great. And so the famine was actually spreading around the earth. It spreads up north, and Joseph's family remembers this, or they're a part of this. You remember them? They sold him into slavery, and he hasn't seen his dad since. They're feeling the effects of the famine. So here's what it says in Genesis 42. It says, when Jacob, the dad, learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other?" He continued, "I have heard there's grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die." Like talking to them like they're grown men. And he's like, "Go." And here we go. The stage is set. The fortunes have been reversed. And all is intact for payback. Here's what we're just going to keep reading. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger. So they don't recognize him. And I just have to ask, why don't they recognize him? It's probably because he walked like an Egyptian. I've been a dad for a week. I'm just working on my dad jokes, so just bear with me. But seriously, it's been a really long time. Like, and Egyptians, they shaved their heads. It's been like, he was 17 and now he's 30. And so they're just in this position. So I just have to ask, here's the big question I want us to answer today is this. What do you do when you've got the power and your words determine the destiny of your enemy? What do you do when you've got the power and your words determine the destiny of your enemy? If you've been with us in the last 3 weeks, it might depend on what you've taken from then. Maybe you haven't done anything with your bitterness. Maybe it's just kind of stuck with you. You're dragging it around. You haven't been able to keep it at bay. And if you do that, sometimes you start to become like the person you don't like, right? And I can't help but think about what Joseph is going through in his mind at this moment. Joseph remembers everything. He remembers everything. He remembers his terror as his older brothers sold him into slavery. He remembers the terror of the slave traders. He remembers it all. How do you forget something like that? He remembers. So for the next 3 chapters, he toys with his brothers. He accuses them of being spies. He sends them on unnecessary tasks and journeys. And I like to believe he's testing them. He's trying to answer the question, have they changed? And he's trying to answer the question himself that we just asked, what do I do when I've got the power? And this is what I just have to say, this is what I love about the Bible, is that Joseph is not like a hero yet. Like he's struggling with what it means to follow God and love him as well. He's very human, just like all of us. And like it's a very raw human story that we can all relate to. I just love that about the Bible. And so here's where we pick up in Genesis 45. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants. And he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he says to his brothers, "I am Joseph." Here's what happens next. They wetted themselves. Their bowels released. Just kidding, that didn't actually happen. You can cross that out. There we go, that's my comment. So now they recognize him. And they expect him to do unto them as they did to him. With one word, he could have impaled them and just decapitated him just like the baker, right? With one word, he's got so much power. And then he asks this, he says, "Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. The thing is, they didn't need to be terrified at his presence. Remember, Joseph chose to live as if God was with him. It was an active choice he made. They didn't know that, but Joseph made that choice. He was able to keep bitterness at bay. And so what Joseph didn't know in this moment, was that God's plan of salvation for the entire world His entire enterprise, the plan of Jesus coming through this one family, hung by the thread of his next words. What happens next? He didn't know it. But we know it now reading it because his brothers, actually, the 12 brothers, they represented the 12 tribes of Israel. And that was the family through which Jesus was going to be born and save the world. And so he did for them what that same Savior would do for us. Here's what it says in Genesis 50. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid." And he asked this question, am I in the place of God? Am I in the place of God? And I think this is the question a lot of us have to ask ourselves sometimes in a lot of situations. Am I in the place of God? Because here's the deal. We will never experience the good that comes from the bad unless we recognize that God was with us in the bad, and then we refuse to play God when things are good. I'm going to say that again. We will never experience the good that comes from the bad unless we recognize that God was with us in the bad, and then we refuse to play God when things are good. Here's what he says. He says in verse 20, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you, brothers, and your children, your families." He reassured them, and he spoke kindly to them. One day, you might have power over the person who hurt you, over the person who took from you, who harmed you. You'll remember in that moment what they did to you or what they took from you. And in the midst of this, our Heavenly Father invites us to remember something. Who was with us? He invites us to remember that he was with us in the midst of all of that. Again, what do you do when you've got the power and your words determine the destiny of your enemy? I believe you have two options. The first one is this. You can pay them back. Again, Joseph, they sold him into slavery. He hasn't seen his father who loves him dearly in years. His brothers hurt him bad. Like I read this, I'm like, why not? Joseph has every reason to pay them back, to get revenge and to have them killed. You can pay them back or you can do something else. You can pave the way forward. You can end the revenge cycle. And I hope we'll take our cue from the one who gave his life for us, Jesus, instead of the ones who took life from us. And if you do in that moment, I believe you'll be most like your Father in heaven and we'll be free. We can end the revenge cycle. We can make a choice to forgive and to redeem. They might not deserve it. A lot of times they don't. But when I think about this, I'm reminded of Jesus on the cross. He was wrongly accused. He never sinned, but he was condemned to death. And throughout that story, he was beaten, he was tortured, spit upon, mocked. And his words on the cross embody what it actually means to pave the way forward. He says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing." Father, forgive them. You see, when we deserve death and guilt and shame for our sin, Jesus paved the way forward for us. By obediently going to the cross and dying for us, he paved a way for us to be with the Father forever. Our relationship with the Father has been restored because of what Jesus has done for us. So for the next 10 minutes or so, we're going to take communion together. We're going to worship together as remember that Jesus paved the way for us. We remember the sacrifice he made on the cross. We celebrate the new life that we have because of that. And so Andrew is going to come and lead us through that moment now.